Rachel Monroe adjusted the knot of her apron and slipped the pendant beneath her collar, just as Bradley Quinn stepped into the dining room. The door's old brass bell had barely stopped ringing when she heard the crisp echo of Bradley's Oxfords on the tile floor. She didn't need to look up to know his gaze had already swept the room and landed squarely on her. The pendant nestled beneath her collar felt heavier than usual. The Laureate had been part of Boston's Back Bay for as long as anyone could remember, its beveled glass windows forever fogged in the mornings, its black and white floor tiles softly scuffed by generations of servers and patrons. It was a place that never rushed, where time moved to the clink of teaspoons and the slow pour of coffee. And on November mornings like this one, when the wind rattled the glass and sent red maple leaves chasing one another across the sidewalk, the warmth inside felt sacred. Rachel moved past table 3, balancing a half-filled pot of coffee, nodding a gentle good morning to Mr. Whitaker as she approached his usual corner. He sat where he always did, near the frosted window, newspaper folded neatly beside his plate of dry toast. A faded corduroy blazer hung off his narrow shoulders like a second skin. He looked up and smiled. "Miss Monroe," he said, voice raspy but kind. "Chilly out there today." She poured his coffee. "It's a wind that doesn't want to quit." He chuckled, reaching into his coat pocket. "And yet you showed up on time again. That deserves something." He slid a folded $5 bill across the table, face down, like always. She tucked it into her apron without ceremony. No thanks needed. It was their rhythm. Behind her, she heard the slow click of Bradley's tongue, a sound sharp enough to pierce silver. Rachel turned just slightly, eyes lowered. "You know the policy," he said, arms folded, voice low but audible. "No jewelry outside the uniform." "It's not visible," she said calmly, moving toward the kitchen. "It moved. I saw it." He took a step closer, his breath a little too close for this early in the morning. "This is warning number. I've stopped counting. One more slip, and you'll be looking for a new diner to ruin." Rachel didn't reply. She stepped through the swinging doors and into the kitchen's fragrant warmth, onions sizzling, butter melting, and Gus humming under his breath. He looked up from the griddle and gave her a look that asked more questions than words ever could. She offered a small shake of her head and kept walking. He slid a plate onto the counter, the waffle still steaming, the edges crisped just so. Without a word, he nudged it in her direction with a wink. Rachel nodded, grateful but weary. She picked off a small corner of the waffle and leaned against the counter for a breath. The kitchen was her safe place, the one spot Bradley rarely entered. Here, amidst the clang of pans and the rhythm of breakfast orders, she felt less like a target and more like a person. "Whatever you hide," Gus had told her once as they were closing up late, "make sure it's worth hiding." She had smiled then. The pendant had always been worth it. It was the only thing she'd had when they found her, curled up under that cedar tree in the park, silent, gripping the little silver crescent like it was oxygen. The memory came in waves, birthday balloons, a red checkered blanket, voices calling her name, and then nothing but trees and the distant sound of water. She had been 5. The foster home had called it an unclaimed necklace, but Rachel had known better. It was hers. She couldn't remember who gave it to her or even what came before that forest clearing, but she remembered the feel of the pendant in her palm. That was enough. Back on the floor, Rachel returned to her routine. The morning crowd was mostly regulars, 2 retired sisters who always split a clam chowder before 9, a young postman on his break who only ever ordered apple crisp and iced tea. She moved like second hand on a clock, unhurried but certain. Bradley circled the room again just after 10. She saw him pause by the bar, tapping something into the POS system, eyes drifting toward her. Rachel straightened her shoulders, but didn't meet his gaze. She knew it was coming before he said it. "If I see that necklace again," he muttered as he passed, "you're fired." It wasn't a threat anymore. It was a promise. By noon, the wind outside had picked up. The bell above the door let out one last tired chime before the afternoon lull settled over the place. Rachel checked the dessert case, wiped down the counter, and gathered her things. Her shift had ended early, an unspoken nudge from Bradley, no doubt. She stepped out onto the porch, the cold air biting at her cheeks. The sidewalk was mostly clear, save for a few leaves scuttling along the curb. She shoved her hands into her coat pockets and exhaled slowly, watching the breath curl. Across the street, a black Lincoln glided to a stop. The engine purred low, almost too quiet to notice. Rachel stood on the porch after finishing her shift early. A cold wind blows. A luxurious black Lincoln has just stopped in front of the restaurant. "You're not irreplaceable, Rachel," Bradley whispered, eyes on his clipboard. "Lose the necklace or lose your shifts." Rachel didn't answer. She kept her head down, cradling a half-full coffee pot as she moved toward table 2. The soft hum of conversation and clink of silverware usually calmed her, but tonight it all blurred into a thick, low murmur. The pendant tucked under her collar felt like it was burning against her skin. She gave it a slight tap with her fingers as she passed the hostess stand, an involuntary gesture now, like checking for breath. Outdoors, the rain streaked down the windows in slow, steady sheets. It had started before sunset, soaking the maple leaves plastered to the sidewalk and giving the whole street a slick orange glow under the gas lamps. Inside the Laureate, candles flickered inside glass domes, softening the gold tones of the tablecloths and catching reflections in polished silverware. A small gas fireplace near the reading corner hissed gently, offering a modest warmth to the regulars who preferred the late dinner hour. Rachel refilled Mr. Whitaker's cup and asked if he'd had a good Saturday. "As good as any when the Sox aren't playing," he grunted, folding his newspaper with a crinkle. "Tell Gus the chowder's thinner tonight." She smiled. "I'll pass the note." They shared a brief laugh. She lingered just a moment longer than usual, savoring the ease of that small exchange. Then came a voice from behind her shoulder, too slick, too close. "Rachel." Bradley's tone was quiet, but not gentle. She turned slowly, catching the flicker of his eyes as they darted to her chest. In her reflection on the glass partition, she could just make out a glint of silver peeking beneath her collar. She swallowed. "I'll cover it better," she said. "You'll remove it," he replied, "or this is your last Saturday shift." Rachel nodded and turned away, though her cheeks burned. Irene caught up with her at the dish bin. "You need to be careful," the older waitress said softly. Her voice carried the tone of someone who had seen too many versions of this exact same story. "He's gunning for you. Just take the thing off." "I can't," Rachel murmured. It's all I have left." Irene sighed. "Then keep your head down. Gus is already running interference." Gus, of course he was. She looked over to the kitchen, where the older man had just stepped away from the grill to send a nod her way. He'd been slipping her longer breaks, switching her sections when needed. He knew more than he let on. Rachel returned to the floor with her tray. The noise of the dining room had picked up as more guests filled the tables. The string lights in the window shone through the rain, their reflections dancing in puddles outside. The jazz track had shifted, something softer now. Autumn leaves played low, almost buried beneath the clatter of plates. At the door, the bell rang again. She glanced up as the hostess welcomed a tall man in a charcoal coat. His hair was silver at the temples, his walk deliberate. He barely seemed to notice the bustle around him as he was led to a table by the window, Mr. Whitaker's usual corner, though he had just left. The man's eyes lingered on the room, then on nothing in particular. Rachel noticed his calm demeanor, the quiet way he moved, like he didn't need to take up space to command attention. She didn't give him much thought. A new guest? A regular type. She turned instead toward table 6, where a group of tourists was arguing about who'd ordered what. One of them waved her over, nearly bumping into her as she passed. The tray in Rachel's hand tipped. Glasses rattled. Then one slipped, then two, and, in a breathless clatter, the whole tray hit the floor. Shards skidded across the tile. A gasp from a nearby table. Someone snickered. Rachel froze. Before she could move, she felt the heat of Bradley's presence at her side. "That's it," he barked, loud enough to carry through the restaurant. "You're done. Pack up." Chairs scraped. Conversations paused. Even the jazz seemed to lower itself. I can explain," Rachel began, but Bradley was already pulling out his tablet, logging into the POS system with practiced fury. "You've had warnings. You're careless, distracted, and that necklace. I said no jewelry, no exceptions. You're out." Across the room, Henry Callahan, seated with his menu still closed, turned to look. At first, his gaze was cool, mildly curious. Then he saw the pendant. Rachel had knelt to gather broken glass. The collar of her blouse slipped as she leaned, revealing the crescent moon. Just a glint of silver, but enough. Henry stared at Rachel, specifically the necklace. His gaze changes from cold to shock. The moment Rachel turned toward the door, Henry Callahan stood and said, "Wait." She paused, fingers tightening around the damp rag she'd used to wipe down the dessert counter. Her name wasn't on the schedule tomorrow, probably not ever again. Bradley had made sure of that. She hadn't even made it to the break room before someone whispered, "He's already updated the system." Henry stood by the coat rack near the entrance, long coat draped over one arm, his other hand resting calmly against the wood frame of the host stand. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Somehow the simple command had cut through the low jazz, the murmur of late-night diners and the distant hiss of the kitchen's closing ritual. Rachel blinked, uncertain. "Sir?" Henry took a step closer. "Do you have a minute?" She hesitated. She should have walked away, but something in his eyes, unreadable, waited, held her. She nodded. They stepped into the small lobby at the front of the Laureate, a room lined with black and white photographs. Chefs from decades past, young couples smiling beside candlelit tables, waitresses in 1950s uniforms posing beside chalkboard specials. The lights here were dimmer, more amber than gold, and the rain pressing against the windows softened every edge. Henry gestured toward the bench beneath the largest photograph, a shot of the Laureate's original opening, dated 1947. "I won't take long," he said. "Just humor me." Rachel sat, hands folded tightly in her lap. She glanced once toward the dining room, where Gus was drying his hands with a kitchen towel, his face unreadable. Irene stood at the bus station, frozen, her hand slowly rising to her chest, as if she were watching something unfold she didn't quite believe. Henry remained standing. "Where did you get that pendant?" he asked. Rachel's fingers drifted instinctively to the chain under her collar. "I've had it since I was 5. He nodded, almost to himself, and then reached into the inside pocket of his coat. She noticed for the first time that his hands were trembling slightly. From his wallet he pulled out a photo, creased, worn along the edges. He didn't hand it to her immediately. He looked at it first, like he was preparing himself for something he couldn't say aloud. Then, with careful movements, he held it out. Rachel took it. It was a child. A girl, 5, maybe 6 years old. She had shoulder-length hair and a bright, open face. She was smiling at something just out of frame. Around her neck, shining clearly even in monochrome, was the exact same crescent-shaped pendant. Not similar. Identical. Rachel's breath hitched. The etching on the pendant, the delicate vine curling along the arc, was an exact match to the one now resting against her collarbone. Even the tiny dent on the upper curve, the kind of imperfection no jeweler would reproduce. She looked up. "This is me." Henry's knees bent suddenly, as if he'd been punched in the stomach. He dropped onto the bench beside her, exhaling with a shudder. "Her name was Sophia," he said softly. Rachel's heart pounded too fast. "No, I'm Rachel. I don't remember." He placed a hand over his eyes, then lowered it slowly. "Sophia went missing 15 years ago. She was 5. There was a party in the public garden. She ran into the trees. We looked everywhere, for weeks." Rachel stared at the photo again. She didn't remember a party. Not clearly, but she remembered pine needles, the sound of balloons popping, laughter that suddenly wasn't there anymore, and a woman, older with silver hair, walking her up a set of stairs, whispering, "They won't ask questions if you don't speak." Bradley's voice rang out behind them. "Excuse me, is this really necessary?" They both turned. The manager stood just outside the lobby's threshold, arms crossed. "She's no longer an employee," he continued. "If this is a personal matter, I'd advise you to take it off-site." Henry stood slowly. "Do you know who I am?" Bradley's mouth opened, then shut. He clearly didn't. "I suggest," Henry said with perfect calm, "you give us another 5 minutes." Bradley hovered a moment longer, then turned on his heel. Henry turned back to Rachel, quieter now. "I'm not asking you to believe anything yet. I had to know if it could be you." Rachel looked down again at the photo, then at the pendant. Something inside her shifted. Not certainty, but something old and quiet. A weight she didn't know she'd been carrying. "That's me." Henry almost collapsed into his chair. Gus speaks for the first time. "I saw that photo 15 years ago, when it was still on every wall in this city." Henry opened his wallet with hands that hadn't trembled in decades and pulled out a single worn photograph. The little cafe near the docks was quiet that morning, its windows fogged at the edges, the tide pressing softly against the piers outside. A low mist hung over the harbor, making the world seem smaller, more intimate. Inside, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the smell of burnt toast and percolating coffee lingered in the air. The only music was the occasional clatter of silverware and the rustle of newspaper pages being turned by a man in a Red Sox cap near the window. Rachel sat across from Henry at a corner table by the gas fireplace, the flames flickering behind glass. Her hands were wrapped around a thick white mug of black coffee, the surface dark and bitter. She had poured in too much sugar as usual, but she never stirred it. The grains would settle eventually. They always did. Henry placed the photograph gently on the table between them. He didn't speak. The picture lay there like a question neither of them could quite voice. Rachel looked down at the smiling girl in the image, the same photo from the night before, now a little less shocking in daylight, though no less surreal. The girl's eyes, wide and bright, the pendant shining, the sunlight falling in soft rays through a stand of trees. "I've made a habit of not getting my hopes up," Henry said quietly. "After 15 years, you learn not to." Rachel didn't respond at first. The cafe's elderly waitress approached with a small plate of scrambled eggs and rye toast, calling Henry Hon as she set it down. He smiled, thanked her, and turned his attention back to Rachel. "You ordered the hazelnut latte," she said, surprised. That's what I usually make for myself, when I can afford it." Henry's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was her favorite. "I used to make it every Saturday morning before we went to the park." Rachel blinked slowly. "You mean Sophia?" He nodded. "She used to dip her fingers in the foam, said it looked like clouds. I never understood why she liked the flavor so much. Still don't." The fire crackled softly behind them. Gus had once told her after a particularly long shift, "There are things a child never forgets, even if he can't name them." She hadn't thought much of it then, but now it curled around her ribs like a second heartbeat. Henry shifted in his seat. "It was her 5th birthday. We had a picnic near the public garden, just a few close friends. Nothing fancy. There were balloons, a checkered blanket. Her mother brought that chocolate cake Sophia loved, the one with raspberries on top." Rachel closed her eyes. The smell of chocolate, the rustle of paper plates, laughter in the distance, a blindfold. "Hide and seek," she whispered. "I was blindfolded." Henry's gaze sharpened, but he didn't interrupt. "I remember running, pine needles under my feet, my father's voice saying, 'It'll always bring you back to us,' when he put the necklace on me." She touched the pendant through her shirt. "And then, nothing." Henry's voice cracked. "When you didn't come back, we thought it was a joke, a game gone too long. Then we realized she was really gone." Rachel looked at him, really looked. The fine lines around his eyes, the way he held his cup too tightly. He didn't look like a man who wanted to control her, or use her, or mold her into someone she wasn't. He looked like someone carrying too many empty years. "I'm not asking you to believe anything you don't feel is true," he said. "I'm just putting this here." He tapped the photo gently. "And waiting for whatever comes next." Her phone buzzed quietly. A message from Gus. "Just checking in. Listen to your heart. It knows the way." She stared at the screen for a moment, then slipped it back into her coat pocket. Rachel reached up and pulled the chain from beneath her collar. The pendant rested against her palm, cool despite the warmth of the cafe. She turned it over. The engraving was faint but clear. To S.H. "Come back to us." Her breath caught. "Henry, would you come with me to meet someone who's never stopped looking?" The gate to the Callahan estate opened with a slow groan, like it hadn't been asked to welcome someone home in years. The driveway curved gently through rows of trimmed hedges, their leaves tinged with orange and red. Fallen maple leaves drifted in small spirals across the cobblestones, stirred by the light November breeze. Beyond the final bend, the house came into view. A three-story colonial with tall windows, white trim, and a wide front porch framed by columns draped in laurel garlands. A pond shimmered just off to the right, catching bits of the gray-blue sky in its still surface. The old greenhouse at the edge of the property stood quiet, its glass panes fogged from the inside. Rachel sat still beside Henry in the back seat, hands folded tightly in her lap. She'd been watching the trees go by in silence, but now, faced with the estate, she couldn't stop staring. Nothing looked familiar, but something in her chest twisted. "You okay?" Henry asked softly. "I don't know," she answered, honest. A woman stood at the top of the stone steps when they arrived. Her silver-streaked hair pulled into a soft bun, her long sweater coat, the color of wheat. She didn't move at first. Then, as Rachel stepped from the car, she brought one hand to her mouth. She came down the steps slowly, as if her legs didn't quite trust what her heart was telling her. Rachel waited at the base of the steps, unsure. The woman stopped just before her, eyes wet. "Sophia?" Rachel's voice caught. "I don't know." Elizabeth didn't hesitate. She reached out and wrapped her arms around her daughter. Not tight, not desperate, just enough to say, "You're here. I've missed you." Rachel stood frozen for a second, then slowly raised her arms and held on. There were no words for a while, just the sound of leaves crunching in the wind and the faintest sniffle. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and pumpkin. The air was warm, with a crackling fire in the brick hearth. Family photos lined the hallway, black and white portraits beside color frames from the early 2000s. Rachel's eyes flicked over them. One image stopped her, a picture of a baby girl asleep on her mother's shoulder. The mother's eyes were unmistakable. "I never changed the nursery," Elizabeth said, leading her down a hallway. "I told myself every year I should, but I couldn't." Rachel stepped into the room. Pale yellow walls, a quilted bedspread with dancing stars. A shelf filled with old toys, still dusted weekly. On the dresser sat a small, hand-painted music box. She reached for it instinctively, turned the key. The tune spilled out, soft, tinny, familiar. "You are our forever star." Rachel remembered the song, the way it used to calm her when she couldn't sleep. A voice humming it, low and gentle. She blinked back tears. In the kitchen, a simple lunch was laid out. Apple pie, hot tea, and slices of soft cheese with crackers. They didn't eat much, but they sat together. Elizabeth asked a few questions, tentative, respectful. Rachel answered what she could. Some memories flickered, others still hid behind the curtain. Margaret, the housekeeper, came in quietly to clear dishes. She paused when she saw Rachel again. "I remember how you used to run up those front steps," she said softly. "Head down, arms wide, like you were flying." Rachel gave a shaky smile. As the light dimmed into early evening, Henry stepped into the den with a small white envelope in his hand. "It was on the gate," he said. "No name, no return address." He opened it slowly. Inside was a single line, typed in block letters. The pendant was never meant to return. No signature, no explanation. Rachel's stomach twisted. She looked at Henry, who read it again silently, then folded it back into the envelope with care. Elizabeth's brow furrowed. "Do you think someone's trying to frighten us?" Henry didn't answer. The fireplace crackled behind them. Elizabeth reached for Rachel's hand, her voice low. "Do you want to stay through Thanksgiving?" Rachel didn't speak right away. She looked out the wide windows at the maple tree in the yard, now bare and reaching. She took a breath, then nodded. "Henry, we need to talk to Gus. He might remember something, or someone." On Thanksgiving morning, Rachel tied on an old apron from the Laureate and slipped the pendant out, letting it shine. The apron was soft from years of washing, its once crisp folds now worn and familiar. A faint stain, coffee, maybe wine, still lingered near the hem. She smoothed it gently, then stepped back from the mirror in the hallway of the Callahan home, the pendant catching a slant of morning sunlight that filtered through the window. It glinted, and she smiled. Outside, Boston stirred to life under a sky brushed with pale gold. Church bells rang in the distance, muffled by the crisp fall air. The city, usually hurried and brash, moved slower on Thanksgiving morning. A sense of pause settled over the sidewalks and storefronts. And at the Laureate, a new sign hung in the front window, handwritten in looping script, framed with pressed maple leaves. "Welcome back, Rachel." The front doors swung open just after 10. Rachel stepped inside with Henry and Elizabeth, her boots clicking softly on the familiar tile. The staff had arrived early to set the place aglow. Strings of dried orange slices and cinnamon sticks lined the windows. Miniature pumpkins sat at the corners of every table. At the fireplace, Gus sat with a newspaper folded on his lap, his reading glasses low on his nose. He looked up as they entered. "Told you she'd come back," he said without standing. Rachel walked straight to him, a brown paper parcel in her hands. She placed it beside him. "What's this?" Gus asked, raising an eyebrow. "Open it," she said. Inside was her old apron, neatly folded, the name tag still barely stitched to the front. Gus unfolded it slowly, running a thumb over the faded embroidery. "Thought you might like to keep a piece of the past," Rachel said. Gus nodded once, then set the apron on the table beside him. "Only if you promise you're building something new." Henry cleared his throat near the hostess stand. "If I could have everyone's attention." The small crowd, mostly staff, a few neighbors, Irene balancing a tray of cider glasses, quieted. "As of this morning," Henry announced, "the Laureate belongs to the community. We've established a new ownership model, employee shared, resident supported, and Rachel," he looked her way, "will help lead it." There was a stunned pause, then a ripple of smiles, some clapping, "Well, I'll be," from the far corner. Irene stepped forward, adjusting her name tag, the one that now read Manager. Bradley Quinn arrived 5 minutes too late. He stood frozen just inside the door, coat open, expression unreadable. His eyes moved to the sign in the window, then to Rachel, then to Henry. "You've made your point," he muttered. "This is cute." Rachel didn't flinch. "It's home." He opened his mouth again, but Gus rose behind her. "Doors that way," the chef said flatly. Bradley hesitated, then turned and walked out without another word. That night, the Callahan house glowed under warm lamplight. The long dining table, draped in Elizabeth's grandmother's lace cloth, stretched from fireplace to bay window. Candles flickered in mason jars. The smell of roasted turkey mingled with cranberry sauce, spice stuffing, and pecan pie. Mr. Whitaker arrived with a bottle of cider and a red scarf knotted proudly around his neck. Irene brought a pumpkin loaf. Even Margaret, the housekeeper, stayed past her usual shift to sip tea and listen. Rachel moved easily among them, pouring wine, checking the oven, adjusting the music volume. For the first time in years, she wasn't serving strangers. She was hosting. As dessert was cleared and second cups of coffee were passed around, Rachel stood. She held her glass with both hands, heart beating steady. I used to think I had nothing, but maybe I just hadn't come home yet. Silence followed, not heavy, but full. Henry reached across the table and took Elizabeth's hand. Gus nodded slowly. Irene wiped at her eyes. Mr. Whitaker grunted. She always did have good timing. Rachel sat back down, laughter easing the moment. Later, after the dishes were rinsed and the last story told, Rachel stepped out onto the porch for air. The stars were bright, the city lights soft in the distance. She reached for the pendant around her neck. She holds the pendant, looks at Henry and Elizabeth, and smiles. Thank you for seeing past the apron. On a quiet Thanksgiving night, surrounded by warm lights and familiar faces, Rachel finally understood what it meant to come home, not just to a place, but to a truth that had waited patiently for her to return. What began with a pendant no one noticed became a reminder that even the smallest acts of kindness can reveal a story far deeper than appearances allow. Sometimes we find our way not through grand gestures, but through quiet moments and the people who choose to see us clearly. Like a porch light left on in a darkened world, compassion has a way of guiding lost hearts back where they belong,